close your eyes and breathe slowly, letting the weight of the day settle gently down into the mattress beneath you, letting each exhale carry a little more tension out of your body and into the quiet dark around you. You are safe here, in this moment, in this room, in this particular stillness that belongs only to the hours between midnight and morning, when the world outside moves without you. And the only thing that matters is the slow, easy rhythm of your own breathing. There is nothing you need to do right now. No decision to be made. No message to be answered. No weight to carry forward into the next few hours. All that is asked of you is to rest and to listen, and perhaps to drift slowly and gently toward the soft and waiting shore of sleep. Tonight, we are going to travel back together, back through centuries and centuries of human time, back to a world lit by candles and warmed by hearth fires, a world of narrow cobblestone streets and wooden ships with salt-stiff sails, a world that was about to be changed forever by something so small it could not be seen, something so ancient it had already shaped the fate of empires long before it arrived in Europe. Tonight we tell the story of the Black Death, the Great Plague of the 14th century, a sorrow so vast and so slow and so complete that it remade the world in its passing, reshaping economies and beliefs and borders, and the very way human beings understood their place beneath the stars. If this voice helps you rest tonight, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, though only if you are still awake, and only when you are ready. For now, let your eyes grow heavy. Let the candles of another century flicker softly at the edge of your imagination. And let us begin. It is worth beginning, not with the plague itself, but with the world that received it. The world of the mid-14th century, which was already a world of considerable fragility and quiet exhaustion, a world that had only recently emerged from the long shadow of famine, and was just beginning, cautiously and slowly, to find its footing again. Europe in the 1340s was a continent of somewhere between 60 and 75 million people, living in a feudal system that had governed the rhythms of daily life for generations upon generations. A system in which the king sat at the top of a long and carefully ordered hierarchy, followed by his nobles, his clergy, his merchants, and at the very bottom, the great quiet mass of serfs and peasants who worked the land from birth until death without wages, without freedom of movement, and without recourse. The land of Europe had been cultivated and recultivated until nearly every available field was in use, and the population had grown right to the edge of what the soil could sustain, leaving very little margin for drought or flood or failure of any kind. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already tested that margin severely, killing millions across northern Europe and leaving behind a weakened population whose immune systems had been quietly compromised by years of insufficient nutrition, a population that, although it did not know it yet, was less well equipped than it might otherwise have been to meet what was coming. Meanwhile, in the counting houses and harbours of great mercantile cities like Venice and Genoa, traders moved silk and spices along the ancient routes of the Silk Road, connecting the markets of Western Europe to the vast interior of Asia in long, slow, steady chains of commerce that passed through dozens of hands and hundreds of miles before any single bolt of cloth reached its destination. It was along these same routes, quiet and ordinary and unremarkable, that something else was also travelling. The bacterium that would come to be known as Yersinia pestis had, according to the most recent genetic research, existed in some form for approximately 7,000 years, quietly evolving in the populations of small burrowing rodents that lived across the great grasslands and mountain valleys of Central Asia, a region of the world so remote and so sparsely populated that the disease circulated for millennia among marmots and ground squirrels and the fleas that lived in their fur without ever finding its way into a human population large enough to notice or record it. The Tarbagan marmot, a creature native to the high steppes of Central Asia, was among its most ancient and persistent hosts, carrying the bacterium across generations without perishing from it, serving as a kind of long-lived reservoir from which, under the right conditions, the disease might spill over into other species, including the species of rat that lived alongside human settlements, and the species of flea that preferred to feed on rat blood, but would, when the rats were dying and hungry alternatives were necessary, turn its attention to the warm skin of human beings. The oriental rat flea, known to science as Xenopsilla chiopis, was the primary bridge between the rodent world and the human world, and it worked its passage in a particularly precise and terrible way, the bacterium multiplying inside the flea's digestive tract until the passage was blocked, causing the flea to feed more desperately and more frequently than usual, and to regurgitate the bacteria back into each wound it made, seeding infection with every desperate bite. This mechanism, identified and described by the French bacteriologist Paul-Louis Simond in 1898, would explain much of the early spread of the disease, though later research would suggest that human-to-human transmission through the air via the pneumonic form of the plague may have been equally or more important in driving the inland speed of the epidemic once it reached Europe. The story of how this ancient bacterium made its way from the high valleys of Central Asia to the crowded harbour of Messina in Sicily begins, as so many of the great catastrophes of medieval history begin with the Mongols. The Mongol Empire, founded by Genghis Khan in the early 13th century, and expanded by his successors into the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, had by the 1340s fractured into 4 separate khanates, each governing a different portion of the vast territory that stretched from China in the east to the plains of modern-day Russia and Poland in the west. One of these khanates, the Golden Horde, controlled the lands north and west of the Caspian Sea, including the fertile steppes along the Volga River and the critical Crimean Peninsula that jutted southward into the Black Sea. It was in this region, in the trading city of Sarai on the lower Volga, that the plague first appears clearly in the historical record, devastating the population sometime around 1346, before making its way westward to the coast of the Black Sea and the fortified port city of Kaffa, known today as Feodosia, a Genoese trading colony that served as one of the most important commercial links between the Mediterranean world and the markets of Central Asia and the Far East. Here, in the autumn and winter of 1346 and 1347, the Golden Horde army under its ruler Jani Beg was engaged in a siege of the city, and here, in one of the most frequently retold episodes of medieval history, the dying Mongol soldiers were catapulted over the city walls, their corpses landing among the terrified inhabitants. In an early and deliberate act of biological warfare that was recorded by the Genoese notary Gabriele de Mussi in his chronicle, written shortly after the events he described. Whether the catapulted corpses were truly responsible for infecting the city's population, or whether rats and fleas had already slipped through the siege lines by other means, the result was the same. The plague was inside Kaffa, and the ships of Genoa were in the harbour. During this period, the port of Kaffa was not simply a military installation, but a busy and prosperous commercial city a place where goods from across Asia changed hands, and where Genoese merchants had lived and worked for generations, maintaining warehouses and counting houses, and a small but well-established community that kept close ties with the mother cities of Genoa and Venice, far to the west. When the plague began to move through the city in the months following the siege, when people began dying in the familiar terrible way, with swellings appearing in the armpits and groin and neck, with fever, and then prostration, and then death following in a matter of days, the inhabitants of Kaffa did what inhabitants of besieged and plague-stricken cities have always done, which is to say they fled in whatever vessels were available and toward whatever destinations seemed safest. Several Genoese galleys departed Kaffa in the late summer or early autumn of 1347, carrying among their crews and passengers not only the terrified survivors of a dying city, but also the rats and fleas that had taken up residence in their holds, and the invisible bacterium that those fleas carried. The ship stopped at Constantinople, where the plague was already arriving by other routes, and then sailed on through the Dardanelles and into the Aegean and Mediterranean seas, calling at ports along the coasts of Greece and Asia Minor, and finally arriving in October of 1347 at the harbour of Messina in Sicily, where the officials and inhabitants of the port were horrified to find that most of the sailors on board were dead already, and those who were still living bore on their bodies the dark and swollen tokens of the disease that would soon be everywhere. The authorities of Messina ordered the ships to leave the harbour immediately, but the order came too late. The plague had already come ashore. It is worth pausing here, in this quiet moment at the beginning of the story, before the full weight of what is coming makes itself known, to consider what the people of medieval Europe understood about disease and about the invisible world of microorganisms that governed so much of their lives without their knowledge. The physicians of the 14th century worked within an intellectual framework inherited from the ancient Greeks, drawing primarily on the writings of Galen of Pergamon, who had practiced medicine in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and on Hippocrates before him, and on Aristotle, and on the great Arabic physicians who had translated and expanded this classical tradition through the long centuries of the early Middle Ages. Within this framework, disease was understood to result from an imbalance in the 4 humours, the bodily fluids of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were believed to govern health when in proper proportion and to produce illness when disrupted. Epidemic disease, the kind that moved through populations rather than striking individuals alone, was commonly attributed to miasma, a word drawn from the Greek for pollution or contamination, a term used to describe a corruption of the air itself, caused perhaps by the rotting of organic matter in swamps, or the alignment of the planets or the exhalations of the earth in regions where geological disturbances had occurred. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, consulted by King Philip VI of France for an official explanation of the plague in 1348, issued a formal report attributing the epidemic to a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius on the 20th of March, 1345, an event they described as having drawn up evil vapours from the earth and the sea and set them loose upon the air. It is easy, at a distance of nearly 7 centuries, to regard this explanation with a gentle, knowing sadness, aware as we are of what they could not see, of the tiny bacterium living in the gut of a flea, on the back of a rat, in the hold of a ship. But it is worth remembering that these were careful, serious, learned men, doing the best they could with the tools available to them in a world that had not yet imagined the microscope or the germ theory of disease, trying earnestly to make sense of a catastrophe that defied every framework they had been given. From Sicily, the plague moved with a speed that astonished those who watched it come, spreading northwest from Messina, through the island and across the narrow strait into the toe of the Italian peninsula. Before winter had properly settled over the Mediterranean, moving along the established routes of trade and travel that linked the great cities of Italy to one another and to the wider world. By January of 1348, the disease had reached both Genoa and Venice, carried by ships returning from the eastern Mediterranean, and had begun spreading inland through the dense networks of roads and rivers that connected these port cities to the rest of northern Italy. Pisa received the disease shortly after Genoa, and from Pisa it moved toward Florence, a city of somewhere between 100,000 and 120,000 inhabitants, one of the great financial and cultural capitals of the Italian world, a city of merchants and bankers, and artists and theologians, a city that had already survived pestilence before, and would survive it again, though not without a cost so great that its effects would be felt for generations. Florence at this time was a city of narrow streets and closely packed buildings, of open market squares, where goods from across Europe and Asia were bought and sold each morning, of a municipal government that took its civic responsibilities seriously and had constructed waterways and grain reserves and public hospitals in the belief that a well-ordered city was a healthy city. None of this preparation was sufficient for what was coming, and the city knew it almost immediately. By the spring of 1348, the plague was moving through the neighborhoods of Florence with a speed that left no time for the customary rituals of illness and dying, the calling of the priest, the gathering of the family, the quiet and orderly transition from life to death that was so central to the Catholic understanding of a good end. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Florentine writer who was in the city during the outbreak and would later use the plague as the framing device for his great work, the Decameron, completed sometime around 1353, left in the preface to that work what is perhaps the most immediate and detailed eyewitness account of the epidemic that has survived from any European source, a description so careful and so precise in its observation of symptoms and social collapse that historians have returned to it again and again across the centuries as a primary document of almost irreplaceable value. Boccaccio described the appearance of the swellings in the armpits and groin that contemporaries called gavocciolus, tumours that grew sometimes to the size of an apple or an egg, and that oozed and bled and eventually gave way to dark spots appearing on the arms and thighs and other parts of the body, spots that were, as he wrote, an infallible token of approaching death. He described the speed of dying, the way in which a person might be healthy in the morning and dead before sunset, the way in which the disease seemed to pass from person to person through touch or through the sharing of objects, through clothing or linens, or the simple fact of proximity. He described the abandonment of social obligation, the way in which fathers left children and wives left husbands, the way in which the careful architecture of civic and family life simply dissolved under the pressure of fear, leaving the dead in the streets because there were not enough people willing to carry them to their graves, leaving the sick alone in houses that no neighbour or friend dared enter. Between the spring and late autumn of 1348, according to later historical analysis of surviving tax records and parish burial registers, Florence may have lost somewhere between 45 and 80% of its population, a loss so catastrophic that it would not recover its pre-plague population levels for more than 5 centuries. Meanwhile, as Florence was enduring the worst months of its encounter with the plague, the disease was moving outward in all directions from its multiple points of entry into the Italian peninsula, flowing northward through the Alpine, passes into the heartland of Central Europe, and westward along the coast of the Mediterranean toward France and Spain and Portugal. It reached the port of Marseille in southern France by the end of January 1348, carried, according to most accounts, by a single ship from Genoa or from one of the other infected Italian ports, and from Marseille it spread rapidly northward through the Rhône Valley toward Avignon, where the papacy had been located since the pontificate of Clement V in 1309, a city that was therefore not merely an important religious centre, but one of the most frequently visited places in the Christian world, a destination for pilgrims and petitioners, and ambassadors and merchants from across Europe, each of whom might carry the disease back with them to their home cities when they departed. Pope Clement VI, who occupied the papal throne during the epidemic, stayed in Avignon throughout the worst of the outbreak, advised by his personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, to sit between two large fires in his private apartments as a precaution against the miasmatic air, and he survived, though many of his court did not. It is to Clement VI that we owe the first official papal response to the epidemic, including a bull issued in September of 1348, explicitly condemning the growing practice of blaming Jewish communities for the plague and absolving them of the charges of well poisoning that had been used to justify massacres in cities across France and Germany. The bull, though sincere in its intent, had limited practical effect, and the violence against Jewish communities continued in many places for months and years afterward. From Avignon, the plague spread outward through France, with what contemporary chroniclers described as a speed almost beyond comprehension, reaching Paris by the spring of 1348, a city whose population at the time was approximately 100,000 people, one of the largest urban centres north of the Alps, a city of the university and the cathedral and the royal court, a city accustomed to thinking of itself as the intellectual and spiritual centre of the Western world. The University of Paris, which had already issued its official explanation of the plague's astronomical causes, now found itself helpless before the disease it had attempted to explain, watching as its own faculty and students died in the same manner as the poorest inhabitants of the surrounding parishes. By the time the acute phase of the Paris outbreak had passed, estimates drawn from later historical analysis suggest that somewhere between a quarter and a half of the city's population had died, with the rate higher in the crowded working-class parishes near the river, and somewhat lower in the wealthier neighbourhoods on the hills, though no neighbourhood was truly spared. Across France as a whole, the plague would eventually kill somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population, a mortality unprecedented in any crisis that had come before. And it would continue to spread, crossing the English Channel by August of 1348, when a ship from Calais landed at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorsetshire, carrying with it the disease that would within 2 years have travelled the length and breadth of England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Eastward from Italy and France, the plague moved through Germany and the Low Countries and Scandinavia and the Baltic lands, reaching the furthest corners of Norway and Sweden by 1350, and arriving in northwestern Russia and the edges of Poland by 1351 and 1352, having in the space of roughly 5 years moved across the entire breadth of the known European world in a slow, inexorable wave that paused for winter and then resumed each spring, following the rats and the fleas and the trading ships and the pilgrims and the soldiers from one population center to the next, with a patience that felt, to those watching it come, very much like inevitability. And so the plague settled into the rhythms of European life, the way a long winter settles into a landscape. Not all at once, but gradually, persistently, becoming a presence that was no longer shocking, because it was no longer new, a familiar darkness that moved through villages and towns and cities, with the slow, unhurried patience of something that did not need to hurry, because time, in the end, belonged entirely to it. By the early 1350s, the first and most devastating wave of the epidemic had passed through most of the continent, leaving behind a silence that contemporary observers found, in many ways, more disorienting than the dying itself had been, a silence of empty houses and unplanted fields, of churches without congregations and markets without merchants, of roads that had once been busy with travellers and were now quiet for days at a stretch, without a single cart or pilgrim passing along them. The chronicler Henry Knighton, writing from his monastery in Leicester, described the aftermath of the English outbreak with a plainness that carries more weight, perhaps, than any more elaborate account might do, noting that in many places not even a fifth of the people were left, and that sheep and cattle wandered freely through fields and villages, without anyone to tend them or bring them home. The agrarian economy of Northern Europe, which had functioned on the labour of millions of peasants, found itself suddenly and dramatically deprived of those millions. And the consequences of that deprivation would take decades to fully reveal themselves, reshaping the relationship between landowners and workers in ways that neither group had anticipated, and that the old feudal order was entirely unprepared to manage. It was, in the quiet and particular way of economic transformations, as significant a change as any of the more visible and immediate devastations of the epidemic, and it would, over the next century, contribute to the slow dissolution of the feudal system itself. Though no one standing in the ruins of 1350 could have predicted the form that dissolution would eventually take. The scent of change was in the air, as it so often is after great sorrows, mingling with the wood smoke of the hearth fires and the particular coolness of a European autumn. And the world, though it did not yet know it, was already becoming something other than what it had been. The medical response to the Black Death, such as it was, unfolded within the severe limitations of 14th century knowledge, and it is worth dwelling in those limitations for a moment, not to diminish the efforts of the physicians and surgeons who struggled to understand and treat the disease, but to appreciate the genuine difficulty of their situation, the way in which they were asked to respond to a crisis of enormous scale with tools that were fundamentally inadequate to the task. The standard therapeutic arsenal of a medieval physician included bloodletting, the drawing off of blood from the body, in the belief that it would restore the balance of the humours, as well as the application of herbs and poultices, the administration of remedies drawn from the pharmaceutical traditions of Galen and Avicenna, and the use of theriac, a complex compound antidote that had been in use since antiquity and was believed to offer protection against a wide variety of poisons and corruptions. The great Avicenna, the 11th century Persian physician, whose Encyclopedia of Medicine, known as the Canon of Medicine, remained a standard text in European universities, well into the 17th century, had written about epidemic diseases and their transmission in ways that came closer than most contemporary European thinkers to a germ theory, adjacent understanding, suggesting that bodily secretions could corrupt the water and soil around a sick person and pass the disease to others who came into contact with them. Guy de Chauliac, the French physician, who served as personal doctor to Pope Clement VI and survived his own bout of plague in 1348, wrote a detailed account of the epidemic in his surgical treatise, Chirurgia Magna, noting the two distinct clinical forms he observed: a bubonic form characterized by the swellings and lasting several weeks, and a more rapid pneumonic form in which the victim coughed up blood and died within 2 or 3 days, without the formation of any swellings at all. De Chauliac's clinical descriptions were remarkably accurate by the standards of later pathological understanding, distinguishing correctly between two forms of the disease that would only be biochemically explained in the 19th century, and his work stands as one of the most careful and honest accounts of medical observation from the entire medieval period. The physicians who treated plague patients risked their own lives in doing so, and many died in the attempt, a fact that was not lost on the populations they served, and that contributed to the sense of helplessness and abandonment that characterized so many accounts of the epidemic from across the continent. During this period of widespread dying and social dislocation, the institutions of the Catholic Church found themselves tested in ways they had never been tested before, pressed between the practical demands of a population desperate for spiritual consolation and the physical reality of a disease that killed priests, along with parishioners emptying monasteries and parish churches and leaving entire communities without the sacraments that the Church taught were necessary for salvation. The last rites, the final anointing and confession and communion that were supposed to accompany every Catholic death became impossible to administer in many places, simply because there were no priests left to administer them, and the Church was forced to make extraordinary accommodations, issuing special dispensations that allowed lay people to hear deathbed confessions when no priest was available, a concession that would have been unimaginable in ordinary times, and that spoke to the degree to which normal ecclesiastical order had been overwhelmed. Monasteries, which were communal institutions by their very nature, proved particularly vulnerable to the disease, and many houses of both men and women lost the majority of their members within the space of a few months, with some being wiped out entirely, their buildings falling empty and their lands reverting to the ownership of local lords or secular institutions. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John de Ufford, died of the plague in May of 1349, before he had even been formally installed in his office, and his successor, Thomas Bradwardine, died within 40 days of his own consecration in August of 1349, the second Archbishop of Canterbury to die of plague within the space of a single year. The papacy in Avignon, under Clement VI, attempted to respond to the administrative collapse by ordaining new priests as rapidly as possible, lowering the usual educational and age requirements in order to fill the empty parishes, a practical response to a genuine emergency that nonetheless had long-term consequences for the quality and coherence of the Church's pastoral ministry in the years that followed. The great cathedral schools and universities that had been training grounds for clerical careers found their student populations decimated, and the long, careful education that had produced the learned clergy of the high medieval period was disrupted in ways that would take decades to repair. It is in the realm of art and literature and popular religion that the cultural impact of the Black Death reveals itself most vividly and most strangely in the proliferation of images and texts that attempted to make sense of mass death on a scale that had never been publicly represented before, that reached for metaphors and symbols, adequate to an experience that seemed to exceed the capacity of ordinary language. The most famous of these cultural productions is, undoubtedly, the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, a genre of artistic representation that appears to have emerged in northern France and Germany in the decades immediately following the first epidemic, and that depicted death itself as a skeletal figure, dancing with representatives of every level of human society, from the Pope and the Emperor, down through the merchant and the peasant to the infant in its cradle, leading each in turn away from the world regardless of their rank or wealth or piety, making visible the essential democracy of dying that the plague had so ruthlessly demonstrated. These images, painted on the walls of charnel houses and churchyards, and public buildings across Europe, served a complex and not entirely mournful purpose, reminding the living of their mortality in a tradition the medieval church had always endorsed, while also incorporating a kind of grim social critique, pointing out with quiet insistence that the noble and the peasant were equally subject to the same fate, that the wealth and status that structured so much of daily life counted for nothing at the final hour. The Decameron of Boccaccio, composed in the years immediately following the epidemic, embedded its 100 stories of wit and pleasure and love within a frame narrative that began with a sustained and precise description of the plague in Florence, using the catastrophe not as its subject, but as its occasion, a way of clearing space from the corrupted and dying city for the telling of stories that affirmed, in their variety and vitality and humour, the persistence of human life and human desire, even in the shadow of mass death. William Langland's long allegorical poem, Piers Plowman, written in England in the decades following the Black Death, engaged with the social disruptions of the post-plague world in ways that were more directly moral and more explicitly critical of the institutions that had failed their populations during the epidemic, and the poem's restless questioning of spiritual and social authority can be read, at least in part, as a product of the world the plague had made. The visual arts of the late 14th and early 15th centuries showed a persistent preoccupation with decomposition and the physical reality of the dead body, a preoccupation that art historians have traced directly to the unprecedented exposure of the living to unburied and improperly buried bodies that the epidemic had forced upon entire populations, and the transy tomb depicting the deceased as a cadaver in an advanced state of physical dissolution became a distinctly popular funerary monument in this period, a form of memorialization that would have been shocking in earlier centuries, but that spoke directly to the visual vocabulary of a post-plague world. The question of blame, which arises with particular urgency in moments of mass catastrophe, when the need for explanation presses hardest against the limits of available knowledge, produced in the years of the Black Death some of the most tragic episodes of communal violence in medieval European history, episodes in which fear and grief and the need for a comprehensible cause combined to direct lethal violence against communities that were already vulnerable and already living on the margins of the social structures that were supposed to protect them. Jewish communities across Europe, already subject to legal restrictions and social hostility, rooted in long traditions of Christian anti-Judaism, were accused in numerous cities of deliberately poisoning the wells and water sources from which Christians drew their drinking water, a charge that was almost certainly not believed, even by all of those who repeated it. but that served a powerful psychological function, transforming the incomprehensible into the comprehensible, and the invisible bacterium into a visible and punishable enemy. The accusations spread through the German-speaking lands with a speed that in some places outpaced the plague itself. And in city after city, in Basel and Freiburg, in Strasbourg and Mainz, in Cologne and in Frankfurt, Jewish communities were subjected to forced confessions extracted under torture, followed by mass killings that took the form of burning, often with the Jewish inhabitants of the city locked into a single building that was then set alight. In Strasbourg in February of 1349, before the plague had even arrived in significant force in the city, approximately 2,000 Jewish residents were killed by a mob acting in advance of the disease they feared. A horrifying demonstration of the way in which fear of plague could function independently of its actual presence. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 and 1349 condemning the persecutions and pointing out that Jews were dying of plague alongside Christians, which constituted fairly obvious evidence against the poisoning hypothesis. But the authority of the papacy proved insufficient to stop the violence in many areas, and the massacres continued until the epidemic itself had largely passed, and the urgency of finding a cause had diminished. It is estimated that in the years between 1348 and 1351, more than 200 Jewish communities in Europe were destroyed, either by massacre or by expulsion, a devastation whose effects on the geography and culture of European Jewish life lasted for generations and contributed to the large-scale migration of Ashkenazi Jewish communities eastward into Poland and Lithuania, where they would rebuild their communities under the protection of rulers more hospitable to their presence. Meanwhile, and alongside these episodes of communal violence, another and very different response to the plague emerged in the German and Low Countries regions of Europe, one that was no less extreme in its way, but that directed its intensity not outward toward a community of others, but inward toward the bodies of its own participants in a movement of penitential self-flagellation that drew hundreds of thousands of participants across the German-speaking world in the years between 1348 and 1350, and alarmed church authorities, nearly as much as it alarmed the secular rulers whose public spaces it invaded. The flagellant movement, whose origins predated the Black Death by nearly a century in sporadic and localized forms, became under the pressure of the epidemic a mass phenomenon of extraordinary scope and emotional intensity, as groups of men, and sometimes women, organized themselves into traveling brotherhoods that moved from city to city, staging elaborate public ceremonies of self-mortification in which participants beat their own backs with leather straps tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood and crying out prayers of repentance and appeals to divine mercy, while crowds of townspeople watched and wept, and sometimes joined the procession. The theology underlying the movement was straightforward in its structure, if extreme in its expression, holding that the plague was a divine punishment for the accumulated sins of humanity, and that voluntary suffering, if sufficiently sincere and sufficiently severe, might persuade God to lift the chastisement and spare those who demonstrated their willingness to suffer for their transgressions. The flagellant movement raised deep and genuine questions about the authority of the Church, since the flagellants claimed a direct relationship with divine mercy that bypassed the mediation of the clergy, and since some of the more radical groups among them preached doctrines about salvation and the priesthood that the Church regarded as heretical. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement in a bull issued in October of 1349, and secular rulers in several regions suppressed it by force, partly because the large gatherings of flagellants moving through cities constituted an obvious vector for disease transmission, and partly because the emotional intensity of the movement was generating social disorder that threatened the peace of the communities through which the groups passed. By the early 1350s, as the first wave of the epidemic subsided, the flagellant movement faded almost as quickly as it had arisen, leaving behind a residue of religious anxiety and a heightened awareness of human vulnerability that would colour the devotional life of Northern Europe for the remainder of the century. The economic consequences of the Black Death were not simple or uniform, and it is one of the more counterintuitive aspects of the history of the epidemic that for some of those who survived it, the plague created conditions of material improvement that would have been impossible before the dying began. A dark and uncomfortable irony that contemporaries noticed, and that moral philosophers of the period struggled to accommodate within their frameworks of divine justice and providential order. The fundamental mechanism was straightforward. Labour, which had been abundant and cheap in the overpopulated Europe of the early 14th century, became suddenly and dramatically scarce in the post-plague world, and the law of supply and demand, which operates with the same indifference to human feeling in the 14th century as in any other, meant that the labour of surviving workers was now worth considerably more than it had been before the dying. Peasants who had been bound to the land of specific manors by the legal and customary obligations of serfdom found themselves in the novel and disorienting position of being actively sought by landowners, desperate for workers to harvest unharvested fields, and many took advantage of the disruption to renegotiate their conditions of service, moving to other manors where better terms were offered, or pressing their existing lords for reduced rents and greater personal freedoms. The English Parliament, responding to the complaints of landowners alarmed by the assertiveness of their surviving workforce, passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, an act that attempted to fix wages at their pre-plague levels and to compel workers to accept employment at those rates, forbidding the movement of labourers between manors and imposing penalties on both workers who demanded higher wages and on employers who paid them. The Statute of Labourers was, in the judgment of most historians who have examined its enforcement, largely unsuccessful in achieving its stated aims, since the economic forces it attempted to suppress were simply too powerful for legislation alone to overcome, and many landowners quietly paid the higher wages their workers demanded, while maintaining the legal fiction of compliance. The long-term consequence of this labour scarcity and the social disruption it produced was a gradual erosion of the serf's legal obligation to remain on a specific piece of land, a process that proceeded at different speeds in different parts of Europe, but that contributed, over the course of the late 14th and 15th centuries, to the effective end of serfdom in most of Western Europe, even as it was becoming more firmly established in the East. It is in the cities, perhaps more than in the countryside, that the economic transformation wrought by the plague reveals its most varied and interesting dimensions, because the cities of medieval Europe were more complex economic organisms than the agrarian manors of the countryside, sustaining multiple overlapping systems of production and trade, and credit that all depended in different ways on the availability of trained and experienced labour and on the smooth functioning of commercial networks that the epidemic disrupted at every level simultaneously. The great banking houses of Florence, the Bardi, and the Peruzzi, and the Acciaioli had already been weakened by the defaults of Edward III of England on the enormous loans they had extended to finance his wars before the plague arrived, and the epidemic delivered a second, and in some cases final blow to institutions that had been among the most powerful financial organizations in Europe, their records incomplete, their partners and agents dead, their business networks fractured by the death of the correspondents who had maintained them. The textile industry of Flanders and northern Italy, which had been one of the economic pillars of the late medieval commercial world, found its supply chains disrupted by the deaths of skilled workers at every stage of production, from the shepherds who tended the sheep, whose wool was its raw material, to the dyers and weavers and fullers, whose specialized knowledge and trained hands transformed that wool into the fine cloth that was sold across the continent. In the short term, the disruption of trade networks meant shortages of goods that had previously been taken for granted, and the economic contraction of the immediate post-plague decades was real and severe, and felt in daily life in ways that went beyond the purely statistical. In the medium and longer term, however, the concentration of inherited wealth among a smaller number of surviving heirs, combined with the higher wages earned by surviving workers, created conditions of relative prosperity for certain segments of the population that funded, among other things, the patronage of art and architecture and learning that we now associate with the early Renaissance, a cultural flowering made possible in part by the extraordinary sorrow that preceded it. It is one of history's more melancholy patterns, the way in which catastrophe and renewal are so often found in each other's company, the way in which the ground is sometimes cleared before new growth can begin. The plague did not confine its transformative effects to the economic sphere alone, but reached deeply into the political structures of 14th century Europe, accelerating some trends that were already underway and precipitating others that might not otherwise have occurred for many decades, reshaping the map of power on a continent that was already in motion along multiple political fault lines. In England, the demographic collapse of 1348 and 1349 did not immediately produce political instability, in part because the strong administrative infrastructure that the English crown had developed over the preceding century proved resilient enough to continue functioning even after the deaths of large numbers of its personnel, and in part because the surviving English nobility, though reduced in numbers, retained sufficient cohesion to maintain the basic structures of royal governance. The deeper political consequences in England became visible only in the 1370s and 1380s, when a generation that had grown up in the post-plague world, accustomed to the relative bargaining power that labour scarcity had given to ordinary workers, and chafing against the attempts of the crown, and the nobility to roll back those gains produced in the peasants' revolt of 1381, one of the most dramatic popular uprisings in English medieval history. The revolt, which brought Wat Tyler and John Ball and tens of thousands of ordinary English men and women into open confrontation with the government of the young King Richard II, drew directly on the social and economic changes that the plague had set in motion more than 30 years earlier, channeling the accumulated frustration of a working population that had been promised, in the chaos of the epidemic, a relaxation of the old constraints, and had then found those promises quietly revoked as soon as the immediate crisis had passed. In France, the political consequences of the plague were more immediately visible and more directly destabilizing coming on top of the catastrophic defeat at Crécy in 1346 and the capture of King John II at Poitiers in 1356, to produce a crisis of royal authority so severe that it nearly ended the Valois dynasty altogether, providing the conditions in which the Jacquerie, a violent peasant uprising in 1358, could briefly threaten the social order of the French countryside, before being suppressed with a ferocity that matched, in its way, the ferocity of the original epidemic. The relationship between the Black Death and the political upheavals of the late 14th century is not simple or mechanical, and historians are careful to point out that the plague was one factor among several in producing these events, but its contribution to the conditions that made them possible was real and substantial, and ought not to be understated. The plague did not disappear after the first great wave of the 1340s, and early 1350s had passed through Europe, and this is a fact worth dwelling upon, because the persistence of the disease through the remainder of the 14th century and well into the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries shaped the experience of post-plague Europe in ways that are fundamentally different from what would have been the case if the Black Death had been a single, finite event rather than the beginning of a recurring presence. The second major outbreak reached England in 1361 and 1362 and was called by contemporaries the Pestis Secunda, or Second Plague, and it was noted by observers at the time for its particular severity among young people, the children and adolescents who had been born after the first epidemic, and who therefore lacked whatever partial immunity their surviving parents had acquired, a pattern of age-specific mortality that would be repeated in subsequent waves, and that gave each recurrence a character somewhat different from the one before. The plague returned again in 1369 and in 1374 and in 1379, and it continued to return at intervals of roughly 10 to 15 years. Throughout the 15th century, each recurrence killing a substantial fraction of the population before subsiding again, and in doing so, it prevented the demographic recovery that might otherwise have been expected to follow the initial catastrophe, keeping population levels in many parts of Europe significantly below their pre-plague highs, until well into the 16th century, and in some regions until even later. It was this prolonged period of recurrence, as much as the original catastrophe, that shaped the distinctive character of late medieval European culture, that sustained the preoccupation with death and mortality that runs through its art and literature and religious life, that made the dance of death not merely a response to a single crisis, but a metaphor for an ongoing condition, a permanent awareness of the thinness of the line between the living and the dead that was renewed and reinforced by each new outbreak, each new silence of empty streets and closed shutters, and the distant toll of a church bell, marking another passage from this world into whatever lay beyond it. And so the world moved forward through the long recurring seasons of the plague, not in a straight line of recovery and progress, but in the slower, more complicated rhythm of a population learning, over generations, to live alongside a disease that could not yet be prevented, could not yet be explained, and could not yet be cured, but that had become, in its terrible persistence, a known feature of the landscape, as familiar in its way as the turning of the seasons or the rising of the river in spring. By the early decades of the 15th century, the cities of Europe had developed a repertoire of responses to the plague that, while still rooted in the miasmatic theory and the humoral medicine of their inherited tradition, represented a genuine accumulation of practical wisdom about how to slow the spread of a contagious epidemic, even without understanding its mechanism. The most significant of these responses was quarantine, a word whose very etymology carries within it the history of the plague, derived from the Italian quarantina, meaning a period of 40 days. The length of time that the authorities of the great maritime trading city of Ragusa, known today as Dubrovnik, decreed in 1377 that arriving ships and travellers must wait in isolation before being permitted to enter the city and mingle with its population. The choice of 40 days as the prescribed isolation period was not entirely arbitrary, carrying within it resonances of the biblical 40 days of flood and fast and wandering that gave it a kind of theological as well as practical authority. But the practical logic was equally sound, since 40 days was long enough to ensure that anyone incubating plague would have manifested the disease before the isolation period ended, allowing the identification and further segregation of the sick before they could spread infection through the city. Venice, which had been among the first cities to be devastated by the epidemic in 1348, developed under the pressure of subsequent outbreaks a progressively more sophisticated system of epidemic management, establishing in 1423 the world's first permanent plague hospital, the Lazaretto Vecchio, on a small island in the Venetian lagoon, where the sick could be isolated from the healthy in conditions that, while deeply unpleasant, represented a genuine public health intervention of lasting importance. The Venetian system of lazarettos and quarantine stations would become a model studied and eventually imitated by port cities across the Mediterranean world, representing one of the first systematic attempts by a government to manage the spread of epidemic disease through administrative action rather than through prayer or purification alone. The science of understanding what the plague actually was, at a biological and bacteriological level, did not arrive until more than 5 centuries after the first great European epidemic, and the story of how that understanding was eventually achieved is itself a story of patient observation and careful experimentation conducted across multiple countries and multiple decades by researchers who were in some ways the heirs of all the physicians who had puzzled helplessly over the disease since the days of Guy de Chauliac. The great epidemics of plague that struck Asia in the second half of the 19th century, particularly the outbreak that began in the Yunnan province of China in the 1850s, and eventually reached the densely populated trading city of Hong Kong in 1894, provided the occasion for the decisive scientific breakthrough that would finally reveal the nature of the disease and the mechanism of its transmission. It was in Hong Kong in June of 1894 that Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss-French bacteriologist who had trained under Louis Pasteur in Paris and had been dispatched to the city by the French colonial authorities, identified in the tissues of plague victims a specific bacterium that he believed to be the causative agent of the disease. Working in a small thatched hut he had built near the main hospital after being denied access to the official Japanese team, conducting parallel research inside the hospital itself. Simultaneously and independently, Shibasaburo Kitasato, the Japanese bacteriologist, who had also trained in Europe under Robert Koch, and who had achieved fame for his earlier work on tetanus and diphtheria, made the same identification and announced his findings at almost the same moment, producing a priority dispute that was resolved only gradually and somewhat awkwardly in subsequent decades, as later analysis suggested that Yersin's identification was the more accurate of the two. The bacterium was initially named Bacillus pestis, before being reclassified and eventually renamed Yersinia pestis in Yersin's honor in 1944, a posthumous recognition of work that had been conducted in difficult circumstances and that had opened the door to all the subsequent understanding of how the disease moved from animal reservoir to human host, through the intermediary of the flea, in the precise and terrible mechanism that Paul Louis Simond would describe 4 years later in 1898, after his own careful experiments with rats and fleas in Karachi. During this same period of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the bacteriological understanding of plague was being established in laboratories in Hong Kong and Paris and Bombay, the disease itself was spreading through Asia and beyond in what epidemiologists now classify as the third pandemic, a global wave of plague transmission that began in Yunnan in the 1850s, and that spread via the steam-powered shipping routes that now connected the world's ports, with an efficiency that the wooden galleys of the 14th century could never have matched, to India, to Southeast Asia, to the ports of Africa and South America, and North America and Australia, reaching San Francisco in 1900 in a ship from Hong Kong, and establishing in the ground squirrel populations of the American West. A reservoir of Yersinia pestis that persists to the present day. The third pandemic killed an estimated 12 million people, the vast majority of them in India, where the disease spread with particular severity through the densely populated cities of Bombay and Calcutta and Pune in the 1890s and early 1900s, producing a public health crisis that was managed by the British colonial authorities, with a combination of genuine medical effort and coercive interventions that generated deep and lasting resentment among the Indian population. The Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, passed by the colonial government in response to the Bombay outbreak, and granting authorities sweeping powers to inspect, segregate, and forcibly remove individuals suspected of carrying the disease, was experienced by many Indians as an instrument of humiliation and violation rather than protection, and the violent resistance it provoked, including the assassination of the Plague Commissioner W.C. Rand in Pune in June of 1897, spoke to the deep tensions between colonial authority and indigenous autonomy that the epidemic had brought to the surface. The Indian experience of the third pandemic would contribute directly to the development of what might be called the political epidemiology of the 20th century, the recognition that epidemic disease could not be managed by medical science alone, but required the cooperation and trust of affected populations, and that measures imposed by force were likely to be resisted, and therefore likely to be less effective than measures adopted with genuine community consent. Waldemar Hafkai, a Russian-born bacteriologist working in Bombay, developed the first plague vaccine in 1897 and tested it in an inoculation campaign that reached hundreds of thousands of people, demonstrating in rigorous field trials that inoculated individuals were significantly less likely to contract the disease than uninoculated controls, an achievement that stands as one of the foundational demonstrations of the power of vaccine-based public health intervention in the modern era. It is worth returning now, in the gentle manner of a mind drifting through connected thoughts late at night, to the world of the 14th century, and to the question of what the Black Death meant to those who lived through it and survived it, what sense they made of an experience that had removed, in the space of a few years, between 30 and 60% of everyone they had ever known, a loss so total that its psychological dimensions are almost impossible to reconstruct from the distance of 7 centuries. But that can be glimpsed here and there in the documents and images and buildings that the survivors left behind them. The great English mystic Julian of Norwich, who was born around 1343 and who lived through multiple waves of the epidemic in the city of Norwich, one of the largest cities in England at the time, wrote in her Revelations of Divine Love, completed in its longer version, sometime around 1393, a theology of divine love so insistent and so luminous that it reads, in retrospect, as a sustained act of spiritual resistance against the darkness of her era, a determined assertion that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, repeated with a gentleness and a persistence that suggests someone who has needed to say it many times, to herself as much as to any reader, in the face of evidence that might easily have suggested otherwise. The anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, another English mystical text of the late 14th century, developed a contemplative theology of radical interiority that directed its practitioners inward and away from the uncertain and dangerous surface of the physical world toward a direct encounter with the divine in the depths of the self that required no clerical intermediary and no outward ritual, a spiritual direction that made a certain kind of sense in a world where the outward structures of religious life had been so severely disrupted. Meister Eckhart and Johannes Tauler and the other Rhineland mystics of the German tradition, whose influence spread widely in the post-plague decades, similarly emphasized an interior spirituality centered on the direct experience of the divine presence within the soul, a contemplative turn that can be read, among other things, as a response to the failure of outward religious institutions to protect their members from the plague and to provide adequate pastoral care in its aftermath. The mystical literature of the late 14th century, in its various national and linguistic forms, represents one of the most remarkable flowerings of religious thought in the entire medieval period, and it emerged directly from the particular conditions of a world that had been stripped of so much of what it had previously relied upon for its sense of meaning and continuity and safety. The Renaissance, that great flowering of art and learning and humanist philosophy that began in the Italian city-states in the late 14th and early 15th centuries and spread gradually northward through Europe over the following 2 centuries, was not caused by the Black Death in any simple or direct sense, but it grew in soil that the plague had profoundly altered, in a world where the old certainties had been tested nearly to destruction, and where the survivors of catastrophe were reaching, with an urgency that had not been present before, for new frameworks of meaning and new ways of understanding the place of human beings in the natural and moral order of things. Petrarch, the Florentine humanist poet, who is often described as the first modern man, lost his beloved Laura to the plague in 1348, and the grief of that loss runs through the later poems of the Canzoniere, with a tenderness and a clarity that reads differently when one knows that it was written in a world where death had recently demonstrated its indifference to beauty and talent and youth. The revival of interest in classical Greek and Roman literature and philosophy, that is one of the defining characteristics of Renaissance humanism, was driven in part by a desire for wisdom adequate to the experience of mass mortality, a reaching back through time toward the Stoic and Epicurean and Platonic traditions that had grappled with the question of how to live well in the face of inevitable death, Traditions that offered resources the medieval Christian framework had not always been able to provide. The visual arts of the Italian Quattrocento, with their new attention to the human body, their interest in realistic portraiture, their development of linear perspective as a means of organizing visual space, according to the laws of human perception, rather than the hierarchies of theological symbolism, can be understood in part as an assertion of the value and dignity of the individual human person in a world that had recently demonstrated how easily and how quickly individual persons could be lost. The great patrons who funded the art and architecture and scholarship of the early Renaissance, the Medici in Florence and the Visconti and Sforza in Milan, and the popes who began in the late 15th century to make Rome the center of a new artistic world, were the heirs of families that had survived the plague and accumulated in its aftermath the concentrated wealth that made patronage possible, and the culture they funded bears, if one knows how to look for it, the quiet watermark of the catastrophe that had made it possible. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the plague was still a recurring presence in European life, still capable of devastating cities and disrupting commerce and killing tens of thousands of people in a single outbreak. But it was a disease that was now being met with an increasingly sophisticated set of public health tools and an increasingly precise medical understanding of its clinical features, even if the fundamental biological mechanism of its transmission remained unknown and would remain unknown for another 2.5 centuries. The Great Plague of Milan in 1629 and 1630, which forms the backdrop for Alessandro Manzoni's 19th century novel The Betrothed, and which was described in meticulous contemporary detail by the public health commissioner Ludovico Sitala and by the Milanese physician Alessandro Tadino, in reports that remain primary sources of the first importance, killed approximately 60,000 people in the city and surrounding region, and was managed by the Milanese authorities with a degree of administrative sophistication that drew directly on the 2.5 centuries of epidemic management experience that had accumulated since the first outbreak. The Great Plague of London in 1665, known to history as the Great Plague, and the last major epidemic of plague in England, killed approximately 100,000 people in the city and its suburbs, roughly a quarter of the metropolitan population, and was described in intimate and unhurried detail by Samuel Pepys in his diary, which he kept throughout the epidemic, with a mixture of self-interest and genuine historical conscience that makes it one of the most vivid personal records of urban life during epidemic disease that any century has produced. Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722, and purporting to be the memoir of a saddler who remained in London during the 1665 epidemic, was actually a work of historical fiction constructed from documentary sources, but it achieved a verisimilitude so complete that it has been used by historians as a primary source alongside genuinely contemporary accounts, and it stands as one of the landmarks of English prose narrative, a work in which the slow, careful accumulation of observed detail creates an effect of documentary truth more powerful than many strictly factual accounts. The London epidemic of 1665 was followed in the very next year by the Great Fire of London, which burned through the densely packed wooden buildings of the old city and inadvertently eliminated many of the conditions of overcrowding and poor sanitation that had sustained the rat populations in which the plague flea could thrive, though contemporary observers were more inclined to see in the fire a divine punishment than a public health intervention. The question of why the plague eventually disappeared from Western Europe, remaining absent after the late 17th century in England and France and the Netherlands, while continuing to appear in Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire well into the 19th century, is one that historians and epidemiologists have debated at length without reaching a consensus, with proposed explanations ranging from changes in rat species and housing construction to possible acquired immunity and changes in the flea populations that served as the primary vector of transmission. The discovery of antibiotics in the 20th century transformed the plague from a disease of terrifying and often fatal consequence into a condition that, when caught early enough and treated promptly, could be managed with the same medical confidence brought to many other bacterial infections, though the word managed is used here with the careful awareness that antibiotic treatment is only effective when it begins, before the disease has progressed too far, and that in parts of the world where access to medical care is limited or delayed, the plague remains a genuinely dangerous condition, even in the 21st century. Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin in 1928 and the subsequent development of sulfonamides and streptomycin in the 1930s and 1940s provided physicians for the first time with tools capable of directly attacking the Yersinia pestis bacterium within the body, and the transformation in outcomes was dramatic and immediate, reducing the case fatality rate of bubonic plague from somewhere between 30 and 60% in untreated cases to below 10% with appropriate antibiotic therapy. A change that represented, in statistical terms, one of the most significant achievements in the history of infectious disease medicine. Streptomycin, the first antibiotic demonstrated to be effective against plague in clinical settings, was introduced in 1943 and used with considerable success in treating cases during the ongoing third pandemic, and it was followed by a succession of other antibiotics, including tetracyclines and fluoroquinolones, that have become the standard of care in plague treatment around the world. The World Health Organization reported in the early 21st century that plague still occurs in a number of countries in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, with Madagascar accounting for the majority of reported cases, and with small numbers of cases continuing to occur each year in the southwestern United States, among people exposed to the infected ground squirrel populations established during the third pandemic. The possibility of antibiotic-resistant strains of Yersinia pestis has attracted attention from public health researchers as a matter of biosecurity concern, since the organism's potential as a biological weapon was recognized and investigated by both the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, and the existence of resistant strains would significantly complicate the management of any future outbreak, though natural antibiotic-resistant plague remains extremely rare in the populations currently monitored. The distance between the 14th century physician lighting fires against the miasma and the 21st century clinician dispensing doxycycline against a bacterial culture is not merely a distance of 700 years, but a distance measured in the accumulated work of thousands of researchers across dozens of countries, each building on what the ones before them had slowly and carefully established, in that quiet and persistent way that scientific knowledge grows, sentence by careful sentence, towards something resembling the truth. It is in the study of ancient DNA, extracted from the teeth and bones of medieval plague victims, that the most recent chapter of scientific understanding of the Black Death has been written, a chapter that has unfolded over the past 2 decades. in a series of remarkable papers published in journals like Nature and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, using techniques of genomic sequencing that would have been unimaginable even to the most optimistic microbiologist of a generation ago. The extraction of ancient Yersinia pestis DNA from the skeletal remains of confirmed plague victims buried in mass graves across Europe, from London's East Smithfield Cemetery, excavated in the 1980s, and yielding bones from victims of the 1348 epidemic to burial sites in Germany and France and Kyrgyzstan that have been subjected to genetic analysis in more recent years, has allowed researchers to reconstruct the evolutionary history of the plague bacterium with a precision that no amount of historical document analysis could ever have provided. A landmark study published in Nature in 2022, conducted by an international team, including researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, analyzed ancient DNA from a cemetery near the medieval city of Kyrgyzstan in the Tian Shan Mountains and found evidence of a Yersinia pestis strain dating to 1338 and 1339, approximately a decade before the European outbreak, that appears to represent or be closely related to the ancestral strain from which the Black Death pandemic originated, providing the first genomic evidence for the geographic origin of the epidemic in or near Central Asia. These findings, combined with earlier genetic work, tracing the evolutionary branching points of Yersinia pestis strains, isolated from modern cases around the world, have allowed researchers to construct a detailed family tree of the bacterium that maps its spread across continents and centuries, with a clarity and precision that the historical record alone could never have provided. The same tools of ancient genomics that have illuminated the biology of the Black Death bacterium have also been applied to the question of the human population's genetic response to repeated plague exposure, with several studies suggesting that certain genetic variants associated with immune function may have been selected for in European populations during the centuries of recurrent plague, a biological legacy of the epidemic that persists in the genomes of living Europeans today, 7 centuries after the first great wave swept through the continent's harbours and market squares and narrow candle-lit streets. The legacy of the Black Death extends, as we have traced through these long and slowly passing hours, through every domain of human experience and every century from the 14th to our own, a thread of consequence so long and so finely woven into the fabric of subsequent history that it is sometimes difficult to see it clearly, precisely because it is so thoroughly incorporated into the texture of everything that came after it. The labour reforms that eventually ended serfdom in Western Europe, the Renaissance arts that still hang in the galleries and churches of Florence, and Venice and Rome, the mystical literature that speaks across 7 centuries with a directness and an intimacy undiminished by time, the public health institutions of quarantine and epidemic management that were developed in the post-plague Italian city-states, and that formed the distant ancestors of the WHO and the CDC, and every national health authority that managed the epidemics of the 21st century, the very disciplines of microbiology and epidemiology and public health policy that arose in response to the recurring challenge of infectious disease. All of these are, in different ways and to different degrees, children of the catastrophe that arrived in the harbour of Messina in October of 1347 on those dark and silent ships. The historian William McNeill, in his foundational 1976 work Plagues and Peoples, argued that epidemic disease has been one of the primary drivers of human history, shaping the fates of civilizations in ways that military and political and economic history alone cannot fully account for, and the Black Death stands as perhaps the most dramatic single demonstration of that argument. A disease that killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia, and that remade the world that survived it into something recognizably different from what had existed before. The philosopher Giorgio Agamben, writing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, noted that states of exception declared in response to epidemic emergencies have consistently served as occasions for the expansion of governmental power and the suspension of ordinary rights, a pattern whose origins he traced back to the plague regulations of medieval Italian city-states. And while Agamben's specific conclusions attracted significant criticism, the underlying historical observation about the relationship between epidemic disease and political authority is well grounded in the record. The Black Death is not only a medieval story, but an enduring human one. A story about the vulnerability that all populations share, regardless of their wealth or knowledge or power. About the way in which invisible biology can override the most carefully constructed social orders, and about the extraordinary capacity of human beings, over time, to observe and understand and respond and adapt, and however slowly to learn. And here, in these quietest hours of the night, with the darkness gathered gently around you, and your breathing grown slow and easy, and your body settled deeply into the warmth of the bed that holds you, it is worth resting for a moment with that word, learn, and with everything it contains, all the centuries of observation and suffering and inquiry and discovery that it represents. All the physicians who watched and recorded and wondered, all the scientists who bent over microscopes and culture plates and sequencing machines in their patient pursuit of understanding, all the historians who read the faded ink of medieval chronicles by lamplight and tried to hear in those distant voices the full weight of what they were describing. The plague that swept through the world of the 14th century was not the last epidemic the world would face, and the history of the centuries that followed the Black Death is in many ways a history of the ongoing negotiation between human populations and the microbial world that surrounds and inhabits them. A negotiation conducted in the languages of medicine and policy and biology and law and art, and faith, and always, always, in the particular language of ordinary human beings, trying to go on living and loving and working in the shadow of something they could not fully control. The survivors of 1348 went on. They planted their fields and mended their nets and opened their shops and rebuilt their depleted communities with the particular resilience of people who have no alternative to going forward, who understand in their bones that the living owe it to the dead to continue living as fully and as carefully as they can. The plague is now a chapter in the history books, and a subject for the long, slow hours of the night, when the past feels close and the distance between centuries seems briefly to dissolve. And you can almost hear, if you are very still, the quiet scratch of a quill on parchment in a candlelit scriptorium. Somewhere in the 14th century, someone writing down what they saw so that the future would know, so that we would know, so that you, here tonight, breathing slowly in the dark, might know that the world has passed through great sorrows before and emerged, changed and humbled and wiser on the other side. The candles are burning low now, in all those centuries behind us, and the towns are quiet, and the fields are resting under the stars, and the long work of history continues its slow turning, while you, here, In this moment, breathe and rest, and let the weight of all those years drift gently away, becoming nothing more than a soft and distant murmur, like the sound of a river heard from a great distance, carrying everything it has gathered on its long journey quietly and without urgency toward the sea. Sleep now. The story is told. The past is at rest. And so, in this gentle and particular darkness, are you.